It was a cold November evening when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone, not after 10 years. 10 years of silence, 10 years of unanswered questions, 10 years of carrying a weight that I didn't fully understand. My mother, the woman who had vanished from my life without a word, stood there. I could see the faint trembling in her hands, the way her eyes darted across the familiar street as if searching for a place to hide. I barely recognized her, and yet, deep down, I knew her instantly. I I need to talk to you, she whispered. Her voice was fragile, almost foreign. I wanted to slam the door, to walk away and pretend the past didn't exist, but something in her eyes, something desperate, almost pleading, kept me frozen. Please, she said, taking a tentative step forward. I let her in. The house smelled the same, unchanged, yet the emptiness had grown heavier over the years. She sat on the worn sofa, clutching her coat tightly around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving mine. I waited, expecting an apology, a story, anything. What came out of her mouth instead shattered the fragile calm I had built around my life. I I didn't leave because I didn't love you, she began, her voice cracking. I had to go. They they threatened me. They said if I stayed, you would be in danger. Her words fell like stones into the pit of my chest. Threatened by whom? What danger? I wanted to ask, to scream, to demand answers, but my voice wouldn't come. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written on it in her shaky handwriting. You need to see this, she said. My hands shook as I took it, the paper feeling heavier than anything I had ever held. Inside was a letter, full of truths I had spent years imagining, twisting in my mind. Secrets about my father, about family I never knew existed, and about choices she had made to protect me in ways I could never have understood. As I read, the world around me shifted. The memories of my childhood, the empty birthdays, the silent holidays, they weren't what I had thought. There were people, forces, circumstances that had kept her away. And yet, despite it all, I had lived 10 years believing she had abandoned me, believing that I had been unloved, believing that I had been alone. Tears fell without permission. Anger and relief collided in a storm I couldn't control. She watched me, her own tears tracing lines down her cheeks, silently begging me to understand. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to reject her. But the truth in that letter made the hatred impossible. It was not abandonment, it was sacrifice. And the realization broke something inside me, the part of me that had been hardened against hope. For hours, we sat there speaking in fragments, filling in the gaps of a decade lost. I learned of threats I couldn't have imagined, of people who had monitored her every move, and of lies that had been necessary to keep me safe. Every revelation was a knife and a balm at the same time, cutting through the anger I had carried while soothing the loneliness I had grown used to. By midnight, I didn't know if I should be angry, grateful, or just numb. My mother's presence was overwhelming. She had returned, but the past decade could never be undone. And yet, as I looked into her eyes, I realized that life, messy, painful, complicated life, had found a way to give us this second chance. We didn't solve everything that night. Some questions remained unanswered, some shadows lingered, but a door, long sealed, had been reopened. And for the first time in 10 years, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what had been lost. I couldn't sleep that night. Her words, her presence, and the letter weighed on me like a storm pressing against fragile glass. I kept rereading the lines, the careful explanations, the confessions she had written with trembling hands years ago. Each sentence was a thread pulling me back into a past I had long since buried. I had built walls around myself, imagining them unbreakable, but she had found a way to chip away at every stone. Morning came reluctantly, casting pale light across the room, revealing the small, lingering dust motes in the air. She was already up, making tea, moving quietly as though she feared the very walls might judge her. I watched her, remembering the little moments of my childhood that seemed insignificant then, but now felt painfully sacred. The way she used to braid my hair, the quiet hum of a lullaby when storms rattled the windows, the small notes she would leave in my lunchbox, hidden between slices of bread. Memories I had thought were hers and mine alone now felt like treasures stolen from time itself. "I should have come back sooner," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I wanted to. I tried, in every way I could, but they always found me. They threatened me every time I even thought of stepping near you." Her eyes, once so familiar, now carried a weight I had never known. I wanted to scream, to demand names, to unravel the web of lies that had governed my life, but I was too exhausted, emotionally drained by the tidal wave of truth. The letter had hinted at people my mother couldn't name, enemies I had never imagined. I tried to grasp it, but the reality was larger than anything I had ever faced. My mother had walked a path through danger and fear, sacrificing her presence in my life to shield me from horrors I could barely comprehend, and I had spent 10 years thinking her absence was hatred, neglect, or indifference. Days passed in a blur. We talked, sometimes for hours, sometimes in silence. The house, once so still, seemed to pulse with our conversations, with the memories and confessions that finally began to take shape. She spoke of my father, what had happened to him, the decisions he had made, the battles he had fought quietly behind the scenes. Each revelation reshaped the foundation of my childhood, of my understanding of family, loyalty, and love. One afternoon, I found myself holding the letter again, this time noticing details I had missed before. There were small sketches in the margins, maps of places I had never seen, coded notes that hinted at dangers lurking in shadows I didn't know existed. It was a puzzle, a key, and a warning all at once. I realized then that my life, the one I thought I controlled, had always been intertwined with secrets far beyond my comprehension. She watched me from the doorway, her face a mask of hope and fear. She said, "I know this is a lot, and I know it might seem impossible to forgive, but everything I did because I loved you, because I couldn't let anything happen to you, not then, not ever." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The anger, the resentment, the sense of abandonment, they didn't disappear entirely, but they softened, melted by a realization that love had always been there, hidden beneath layers of fear and sacrifice. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the 10 years lost, to reclaim the fragments of a life stolen by circumstances I hadn't understood. We spent that evening walking through old photographs, laughing quietly at forgotten moments, crying over memories too painful to ignore. The house was no longer silent. The walls, which had held 10 years of absence, seemed to breathe with our voices, our stories, our confessions. It was tentative, fragile, but it was real. As night fell again, I realized something profound. The past could not be undone, the years could not be returned, but the present, this moment, this fragile connection, was ours to reclaim. And for the first time in a decade, I felt the possibility of healing, of building something new on the ruins of lost time. The days passed in a strange rhythm of revelation and unease. My mother had stayed, but the air in the house felt charged, as though some unseen presence lingered just beyond the walls. She refused to speak of it at first, that the tension in her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows, she finally opened up about the threats that had chased her, the people who had shadowed her every step. "They weren't just after me," she said, her voice trembling. "They wanted you. They still might. That's why I had to leave, why I had to disappear. If I stayed, you'd have been their target." I felt my stomach drop. I had never imagined that the world I thought safe and ordinary had been so dangerous, that my existence alone had been enough to put me in peril. She handed me another envelope, smaller, almost insignificant compared to the first, but inside were photographs, letters, documents, proof of a life I had never known. There were faces I didn't recognize, places I didn't know existed, names that had only appeared in whispered conversations over my mother's shoulder when I was a child. One by one, they revealed a web of secrets, hidden accounts, long-forgotten feuds, alliances formed in shadows. And in the center of it all was me. As the days stretched on, I began to see patterns, connections that had been invisible before. My mother had made choices that had saved me countless times, though I had been blind to them. The missed birthdays, the abandoned holidays, they were not acts of neglect, but of survival. And yet, knowing this didn't erase the pain. 10 years of absence had carved deep lines in my heart, lines that no letter, no explanation could fully erase. One night, I found her sitting alone in the living room, staring at an old photograph of me as a child. "I wish I could have told you sooner," she whispered. "I wish I could have held you and protected you openly. But the world isn't always kind to those who try to do the right thing." I sat beside her, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us both. "Then tell me now," I said quietly. "Tell me everything." And she did. She told me of the men who had pursued her, of the threats that had forced her into hiding, of the allies she had found and lost. She spoke of my father, a man I had barely known, whose own life had been complicated by shadows I was only beginning to see. Every revelation reshaped my understanding of the past, filling in the missing pieces of a puzzle I had spent a decade trying to solve. As much as I learned, I realized that our reunion was not just about closure, it was about survival. There were still dangers lurking in the corners of my life, threats that had followed her as closely as they had followed me. And yet, amidst the fear, there was a strange sense of empowerment. Knowledge, I discovered, was the first step towards reclaiming the life I thought had been stolen. Together, we began to make plans. I didn't understand everything, didn't fully grasp the scale of what she had endured, but I knew that I could no longer stand idly by. For the first time in 10 years, I felt a purpose that went beyond anger and hurt. It was about protecting the future, about taking control of the narrative that had been written for me by forces beyond my comprehension. And in the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed distant and irrelevant, I found myself looking at her with new eyes. The woman who had abandoned me was the same woman who had risked everything for me. The mother I had mourned for a decade was finally here, offering a fragile, imperfect second chance. And I realized that some things, no matter how long lost, could still be found. Days turned into weeks, yet the tension never fully eased. My mother and I moved through our days as though the world had shrunk to the four walls of this house. And yet outside, shadows of the past seemed to stretch longer with each hour. One evening, as I was sorting through the papers she had brought, I found a note that made my heart stop. It was short, typed, and cold. "We know where she is. We know where you are. Leave now or face the consequences." The threat was real, and the realization struck me harder than I expected. All the years of fear my mother had endured, all the sacrifices, were not behind us. They were still here, lurking. I looked at her, expecting to see panic, but instead, I found determination. The same woman who had vanished to protect me was now standing beside me, ready to fight, ready to reclaim what had been stolen from us. "You should have told me," I said, voice trembling. "All of this, everything. I tried. I tried every way I could, but every step I took put you at risk. I didn't want you to know the danger, to carry the burden I had to bear alone. But now, you need to understand. We can't run anymore. We have to face it. In the following days, we prepared. Every secret my mother had kept, every detail in the letters and documents became a weapon, a shield. We uncovered hidden accounts, traced movements of the people who had pursued her, discovered allies who had remained loyal despite the years. The picture was terrifying, intricate, and yet strangely empowering. The world that had seemed ordinary when I was a child was in fact a battlefield, and I, unwillingly, had been thrust into the middle of it. Then came the night that changed everything. A shadow fell across the doorway, a figure I did not recognize. Fear gripped me, but my mother's hand found mine, grounding me, giving me courage. She said softly, "Stay calm. We are ready for this, together." The man stepped forward, revealing himself not as an enemy, but as someone connected to the very mysteries my mother had described in her letters. He carried truths that shook me to my core, betrayals by people we trusted, secrets about my father's final days, and warnings that the past was far from over. The confrontation was tense, the air thick with unspoken threats and fragile trust. And in that moment, I realized that my life, my choices, and my understanding of everything I had believed were about to be rewritten. In the days that followed, I learned more about my mother than I ever had in a decade. She spoke of sacrifices, of nights spent awake fearing for my safety, of moments when she had nearly lost hope, yet had never stopped loving me. And I, who had grown up with anger and resentment, began to see the strength and courage that had always been there, hidden behind her absence. By the time the first snow fell, blanketing the world in white, something had shifted between us. The fear, the anger, the distance of 10 years, it was still there, in fragments, but it no longer controlled us. We had faced shadows, uncovered truths, and survived. And in the quiet moments, when the storm of the past finally subsided, we found each other again, not just as mother and daughter, but as allies, as companions, as survivors of a story that had been written in danger and secrecy. Sitting by the window, watching the snowfall, I realized something profound. Life had given me back a part of myself I thought was gone forever. My mother, the woman who had broken me with her absence, had returned not to destroy, but to rebuild. And I understood then that some wounds, no matter how deep, could heal, not by erasing the past, but by facing it together. And as I held her hand, I knew one thing for certain. The past would always be a part of us, but the future, fragile, uncertain, and terrifying, was finally ours to shape.